I said, welcome. I am Laura Causey. I am the elementary curriculum specialist here at the parish school. I'm also a former teacher here at the parish school. I taught in both lower elementary and then the upper elementary department. So I've been here about 6 years. All right.
Hi,
Andy.
I'm Stephanie Landis. I'm a speech language pathologist. I work in the elementary level right now. I'm currently the lead elementary SLP, and I also cover one classroom in the elementary. This is my 15th year here, and I've been all over. I think I now officially have hit every level, from the itty bitties to upper elementary.
And hi, my name is Haley Bozeman. I'm head of elementary this year. I'm also a former teacher at Parish in upper elementary. I worked here about 7 years ago and went to the public school realm and got into admin, and now I'm back. Very excited to be back in about the year. Yes. So I'm not really presenting today, but I'm here for any questions you may have on programming and things like that. So without further ado.
To me. All right, so our goal today is to kind of understand the standardized testing that we do here in the elementary program. So our focus today, key topics, we're going to talk about the MAP test because that is what standardized testing, if your students are in the elementary, lower, primary, and upper, have been experiencing for the last couple weeks. And then also throughout the year, depending on when they were last tested, some of your students will be having language testing. All your students will be having language testing at some point during the year. It's not like a certain time. It kind of depends on the calendar year. So these are sort of our topics about what we're going to talk about today. Feel free to stop us with questions throughout, and we'll also have time at the end for questions as well. So MAP testing is known as the Measure of Academic Progress. It's done by the Northeast Evaluation Association. That is the company that created the MAP test. It is a computer adaptive test that is used around the country at different public and private institutions. It is a computerized adaptive test, so the test is done electronically on iPads here at the school. And it's individualized because it's kind of the way we'll explain more about what computer adaptive is, but each test is individualized for the kids, so the tests don't look identical to each student. So someone could be looking at a different question, their question 2, and someone else's question 2 could be completely different. It's very individualized. We do it twice a year. We do it in September, and we do it in April. My apologies. We do it in April. We do that to kind of measure the growth because MAP is really about the students' progress throughout the year. We started in September, and then we do it in April to kind of see their growth in the year. We do primary, lower, and upper all do reading and math tests, and then we add the language test to the upper elementary students. So they do 3, and the other levels just do 2. We do it over a course of a week. We do 2 days for math and 2 days for reading, and then language we do the same thing, 2 days. We do it in about 45-minute blocks to kind of give them just a short little time, and we kind of cut them do half the questions one day, do the second half in less. And other students that might need more extended time, we do provide that accommodation as well. So, computer adapted test. The test has a bank of questions that they use for the beginning of the test. And there's a range of concepts and level of difficulty. Depending on how the child answers one question will determine what kind of question they'll get for the next question. And they do that for about 10 to 15 questions to kind of normalize what level your student is working on. So it is okay for them to get some questions they've never seen before, and it kind of gets them a little nervous, but we kind of prep the kids and front load them. It's like, it is okay if you do not know this question. It's sort of, I kind of give them the analogy, it's like a video game. It's trying to find where your level is. So they're going to ask you really hard questions, and then they're going to probably ask you some easy peasy questions, and then they're going to find that zone of proximal development right where they're working at. And so that can feel a little stressful to some of our students, especially those who have kind of those anxiety or worries. So it's something that's why we kind of do this testing twice a year and kind of get them comfortable with that concept, because it is kind of hard when you see something and the overwhelming feeling is completely normal, and we have to kind of tell them, it's okay if you don't know them, and we start talking about making smart guesses and just sort of some test-taking strategies for those kind of concepts. What they're looking for is trying to get their level of what kind of questions they can get 50% of the time. So they're not even trying to get them to get 100% right. They're trying to find where the kid gets 50% right. So that can feel kind of hard for our kids. But that's what MAP kind of does to try to find that zone of proximal development where your child is at. It's really not about concepts mastered. It's really trying to find where is your child ready to learn next. So it's not really focusing on the mastery part. We do a lot of that mastery kind of checks through our formative and unformative assessments we do throughout the year that are more paper-based and individualized for our students. This computerized, because it's standardized, this is what they're kind of going for. So here's a sample of a math question. This is a primary question. The primary level gets the K2 test, which has the human voice. So as you can see, there's just the picture of the question. We teach the students how to press the little speaker button, and it will read the question aloud. And this question, they're having to match the capital letters with the lowercase letters. So there's a little bit of an executive functioning process here as well. So sometimes we know our students can do this skill, but they also have to tap once and then tap to the blank. And as you can see, that instruction is not always provided. So we are allowed to help students with the instructions. We can't necessarily help them like match it. And that can be kind of hard for some, especially our primary students who are not as familiar with that standardized testing. We do have practice sample tests that the students do, and this is one of the examples. So we kind of show them, you have to tap and things like that. So we kind of do show them sort of the nuances of testing takes like this. Because the primary test does have a lot of like, it says to drag, but really their version of a drag is a touch and a drop, which if you're looking at the definition of a verb, drag, that's not drag. That's like press. So like things like that where, you know, standardized testing is not a perfect science. And some of these tests really hone in on those kids' executive functioning skills, and that plays a huge piece as to why maybe they're not successful with a question like this. But it doesn't necessarily say that they can't do this skill, which is why we assess in a different way to measure whether they can do this type of skill.
Luckily, most of our kids have some practice on iPads, though, so they pick up on these skills.
Mm-hmm. And our IXL program, which some of y'all are familiar with, has a similar template. And so that their work with IXL also helps them with their, sort of these interfaces, because IXL and MAP are kind of aligned. So some of the activities you do in IXL kind of prepare them for questions like this. Here's another example of a primary math question. As you can see, there's the human voice. What they have to do is show a subtraction problem, 5 minus 2, and they have to put the X on 2 cookies. So they have to model what 5 minus 2 is. Kind of tricky. All right, in lower and upper elementary, they take the reading test as well. Theirs has a passage, and then they have questions. Read aloud accommodation is provided for children in upper elementary with a reading language accommodation from their IEPs, and also all of lower gets the read aloud accommodation. So a voice will read it and will read the answer choices. So it becomes more of an oral comprehension assessment for them. And this is an example of lower and uppers, sort of what a math question might look like. They might have a pictograph, they're busy a key, and they're allowed to use their strategy binders. We highly recommend it. Throughout the year, teachers are working through the strategy binders, getting them as independent as possible. And as we start preparing them for the test, we show them how to use it. They can use whiteboard, scratch paper, manipulatives, anything they use in the classroom, they're allowed to use on that test. So the benefits of doing the standardized testing, it's done twice a year for easier for us to see growth. We like to see kind of a growth in their ability to test. It does give us some valuable information with their executive functioning and their processing skills, because as you can see in those questions, some of that, there's a heavy part of executive functioning and processing that is required to take these tests. It does provide an individualized assessment. Like I said, no kid's test is exactly the same. And it also, for some students, it does show us some good academic progress for students who kind of are well, what's the right thing to say, are kind of prepared with the test and are showing growth and maybe potentially thinking about transitioning. Some of the drawbacks, because like I said, standardized testing is not a perfect science. Some of our kids have that impulse control that we're working on with them, and they're gonna kind of click things really quickly, and that can cause them to, click something that they didn't mean to, or press next when they're getting a little anxious with the test because they're just like very anxious. So that's not necessarily, we can see that. It does not focus on what they mastered, which I think is really hard because they're focusing on trying to find that zone of proximal development. So it's not really showing us that they've mastered a skill, it's showing them they're ready for this. So from a data perspective, it doesn't quite show us what the mastery thing is, it's showing us where we go next. It is individualized, which that is sort of, we know it's individualized, but there's much more accurate testing in group settings. So things that we do outside of standardized testing gives us a lot more data. Also, the sort of the nuance or novelty of the situations, like you'll saw some of that, the cookie question, things like that. Doesn't necessarily mean your child does not know what 5 minus 2 is. It's just, can they model it with a cookie? Like, that's something that's very nuanced and may not be the way it was presented towards the teacher. It may not have, you know, we don't allow to do too many verbal prompts. And so, like, we can't really tell them, like, get out that page 4 in the strategy binder. We can't say that. But, like, if that person had done that, probably would have gotten the question right. Just so you have to pull back some of those supports. And so it doesn't necessarily show that the child can, it shows the child can't do the skill, but we know the child can, just needs a few supports in place. And because math is standardized, there's only so many supports we can provide. All right, so the next thing we're going to kind of work on is understanding the scores. So in October conferences, teachers will be presenting you the score sheets. Like we said, we want to kind of really hone in on the fact that it's not based on, it's not about mastery, and it's really not, comparing one individual to another is, it's not really meant for that. It's really meant to show your child's growth. So that's really what the test is used for, is showing growth. Comparing is kind of tricky, especially because it's an individualized assessment.
And one more thing to keep in mind, this is just like a snapshot of what your kid did on that day. Maybe your child didn't sleep well the night before. Maybe you were going through something else. Maybe they're just not in the mood to take a test that day. Like, it's just one little snapshot of what they could do there. You could give them the same questions the next day, and maybe they'd answer totally different. So, I mean, we know that our kids will answer give them the same question and they'll answer it totally differently.
Yes. So this would be an example of what this report will be that you will receive in October. You'll kind of see a bar graph depending on how many years your student has been here. You'll kind of see different years, and you'll see kind of the different colored bars. The blue bar is your student score. The district level means that would just be a parish school. That's our district. And then norm grade level, that would be students with the same age as your child. So that one is kind of tricky because it's a standardized test. We have to put their age on the assessment, which doesn't necessarily match what academically level he or she may be working on. But because it's a standardized test, we have to put their birth year in there. So that's the yellow. That would be the yellow.
Age broad students in the U.S. or
yes.
Just students in the parish?
It would be broad U.S. students, anyone who took the math test. So any 9-year-old who took the math test would be the yellow bar. So anyone who took the test.
And then the orange, sorry, the district?
District would be parish.
Just parish school. So comparing against kids like in all levels at parish or just their age?
Their age. So all the parish school kids at that particular age, yes. And then this blue spotted one, they like to, especially in the fall, they'll give you like a projected growth goal. And so what math is predicting is like they would like to see this person get to a 186. That's just a projected goal. Because like I said, math is all about growth. And so they're kind of trying to predict, like, we would like to see this kind of growth. And it kind of shows what we would like to see.
How would we learn how the parish kids are doing, not necessarily in the age group, but in the class level? Grade level. Yeah.
That one, good question. That one I'll have to look into because it's based on age, that's the one that's kind of tricky because we have mixed levels in the classroom. So it'd be based on in each child in your kid's class, it's the same age as your child, they would be compared together, but they wouldn't compare the 8-year-olds and the 9-year-olds, they just compare the 9-year-olds. So I'm not sure if there's another chart or data that we can look into to see if that would be.
Some of the reports that y'all do, they kind of can show you a little bit about like grade level at the parish, right?
Yeah.
Like you can tell if your kid's doing like kinder reading and like first grade math.
Yes.
So like you can kind of tell.
Yeah. So the RIT score is what you'll see on the report. It's called the Rosh unit. It's sort of a math. It's like a ruler. It's it shows sort of your academic scale, and it's sort of like kind of the zone of proximal development. and you'll kind of see the RIT score. You'll get a RIT score for math and a RIT score for language in the test, and that's sort of the kid's score on the test. And what we'll show you in the next couple of visuals is the RIT score correlates to a grade level of what type of questions your child was answering. So the RIT score has a grade level component. So then you're kind of seeing what kind of grade levels they were working on.
Yeah, it's kind of different than most tests, in that you're not like 182 doesn't mean like they answered this many questions right or this many questions wrong. It kind of correlates to what Laura was saying of like that zone of proximal development. So it's a little bit of shift in thinking of what the scores mean.
So I think this visual kind of shows like the lowest RIT score is like 100 and the highest would be a 260. And you can see like there's kind of a grade level scale it kind of goes to. So like kinder is sort of in that a little below 141.
There we go.
So we created this little visual that kind of shows you the range for the RIT score. We'll have a beginning of the year one, and then we'll have one at the end of the year. So with your scores, we will be plotting your child's score in relation to the RIT score by grade level. And as you kind of see, there is a massive jump in scores between kinder and second, but as you can see, the RIT scores between second and fifth grade are very close, which means the standard deviation of scores is very low. So like, you might not see a massive jump when they're kind of in these scores, but like any amount of points is growth, and that's sort of kind of what you're looking for. Any progression forward is showing growth.
Which was hard for me when I come from a different, like the language scores are totally different from RIT scores. So when I was looking at some of these, and I was like, oh, they got like 2 points of growth, but it looks like it's showing they grew this much, and reading it was just odd until I saw it kind of plotted in the other ways, where I'm like, oh, they're not supposed to gain like 10 points from the spring to the fall, or fall to the spring, or 12 points each year. Like, small amounts of growth is actually quite good.
So do we have the RIT scores from last year, like from first grade, second grade, and parish?
If they took it here at Parish, it will be plotted on the previous one.
Yep.
No, I mean,
go back.
was it implemented? Because I don't remember.
If your child was here in primary in the past few years or lower, then they took it.
Oh, okay.
So let's see, and then here it will be the same sort of visual we'll show you for math as well.
Last year math scores are probably on the portal, right?
They'll be on the portal, and on the
Okay.
sample report, if they any year that they've been here will be on your report, so you can kind of see all the years that they've taken the test here at the parish school will be on your student report. And then language test, children who are at first year of upper, you will not have any comparative bars because it is their first year to take language. So this would be kind of like baseline, and then in the spring you'll kind of get to see that comparative data. So levels, so primary is the 5 to 7-year-olds, lower is 8 to 10, and upper is 10 to 12. All primary takes the K2 test, which has the human voice, which is that read aloud speech to text type of accommodation, and it's a part of the test. We can't add additional read aloud accommodations for that test. There are some questions because they're trying to assess their reading ability where they take it out, and we can't add it back in because it's built into the test. So for that particular test, the read aloud is built into the test. When they move into lower and upper, all lower students receive the read aloud accommodation for both reading and math. In upper elementary, for students we feel don't need that support, we pull back. Those who do need it, who have a language-based reading disorder, will always have the read aloud accommodation for all tests if needed. But for the reading test, we do sometimes pull back that support to kind of see how the children are reading on their own, especially students who are transitioning potentially, and kind of get that standardized reading data from them. All students are allowed to use strategy binders, manipulatives, anything they use in the classroom they're allowed to use for that testing.
Is it a time test?
It's not.
Okay.
We give them our time, we kind of give them 45 minutes in blocks. However, they're not expected to finish, and we usually stop them about halfway each day to kind of with stamina and just giving them chunking it, and also kind of preventing that fatigue, click happiness. And so we do them about halfway, and then if they need extended time, then we pull them for separate times.
Okay. Now, if they need extended time, or if they qualifiers like already have in their file, okay, so
Yeah.
if they just need it, they get it.
Yeah,
Okay, got
yes.
it. No one's asked for it.
No.
Okay.
And then I believe that a lot of the teachers will keep track of how much time it took, and if they finished early or needed more time, so we can kind of use that as well.
Yes. So in addition to your score sheet, you will get to this observation sheet, and you will actually see how many minutes your child worked on each test. And that way you can, that also I feel is very helpful, because if you see like 5 minutes, that kind of tells you, okay, we were not ready for this. There was some click happiness going in there, because we want to, as you say, their testing time is about 45 minutes a day. So like if you're seeing something less than like 30 minutes, you might worry that there might be some fatigue issue, and there might be some stamina that we need to work on, because each test is about 40 to 43 questions, so it's long, which is why we kind of cut them around 20, and then we do the second 20 the next day. So there's some stamina that the children have to build up to, especially our younger students in primary. Sitting there for 45 minutes is really hard, and it's something they're going to work towards.
And are they sitting one-on-one with the teacher, or they're in a group?
They're at their desk with iPads and headphones.
Okay, with other kids around them doing the same thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something else that's noted on this form, you'll see the little use characteristic things. We have teachers monitoring observations, because we also use this test for data to kind of see how are they doing in a standardized testing form, because I think that's helpful for any child when transitioning. They're going to have to take standardized testing, which means we've got to kind of build up the skill. It's a skill to take a computerized test. And so we're going to be looking at whether they're giving their best effort. Did they click answers without listening? Did they appear calm? So kind of watching those test anxiety situations and seeing what we might need to work with as those students. Also, do they feel like, did they get really frustrated or anxious? Because if we start seeing that, that's when we know to stop. That bailout is done for the day. And we're looking at these behaviors as well, because this is data for us to be like, okay, we need to kind of make a plan and work on possibly some additional accommodations, or kind of help this child get through this process. Because unfortunately, no matter where you kind of go, standardized testing is going to show up. And so we feel like it benefits our students to do this test twice a year. One, because it gives us some good data on where they are, but also gives them real life practice of what a standardized testing would be, and will help us in this environment provide the right support, so wherever they go next, we can make sure that their file has, hey, if you're going to administer standardized testing, for this child to be successful, we need these supports in place, and we have data to prove why that is necessary. So we really do feel this helps us to help them in their future placements.
Yeah, you could take that to a 504 meeting or at your public school and easily be like, here are the accommodations we were getting before. We have data to show that they need it. We need to put this in place. Because even though in the public school system, they only do the STAR testing in like 3rd, 5th, certain grades, they'll be doing in the younger grades, depending on the school district, they do different standardized testing. My daughter at HISD has to do Renaissance testing, like, I swear. But like, I swear, I'm like every other month, she's like, I did Renaissance testing today. And I was like, what? Oh, okay. All right, hopefully you learned something too. But so it's something that they will be doing then too, that you can get the accommodations on those standardized tests and not just the like big scary STAR testing as well. And other private schools, even if you're not transitioning to the public school system, other private schools do the same thing, have standardized testing.
Something else we'll be documenting, we'll document whether or not they use their strategy binder. Like I said, everyone's allowed to have it, but we do like to document if they actually opened it and used it. Because like I said, during map tests, we allow them to have it, but we can't be like, hey, go to page 4, that's going to help you. We can't do that. What we have to kind of see is like, does your child know, go to page 4 to the hundreds chart and use that to help you. That's where we're kind of also looking like, can they independently access a strategy and know to use it? And I think that this kind of gives you real life data of whether or not they are at that step. If they're not, they're still using those verbal and visual prompts. That also tells us, okay, they still need verbal and visual prompts to do an activity like that. They also allowed, do they take it in a small office? Friends that we feel like they need that smaller space, that is an option that we can do. We have this one where answers are written orally. Since the computer does read it aloud, if we think the student benefits from human voice, we might do that. Map test has sort of like certain criteria as to when we can do that, and you have to kind of have to be that monotone computerized voice that you don't like inadvertently make your voice higher when it's the answer choice, because sometimes that can kind of happen when you're looking at sort of the choices. You have to really kind of stay monotone. It's real.
B,
yeah, because there's some that are like, even just inadvertently, you can kind of, you're like, oh yeah, that one.
Which are things that we do in class to try and prompt and help as they're doing some errorless learning while we're teaching, but don't want to carry that over into the testing.
Yeah, so Matt really does recommend the computerized voice because it doesn't have that voice. But it is something we can offer. We do feel like the child needs to be in a separate situation. There's been times when like a student needed to read it and I read it one more time. I read it for them. We also, there's like tools on the map test that we're training them on. Like there's a finger icon where if they don't want to read the whole thing, they can practice just pressing the thing. And those are just skills that we work on with the students. But like if you don't want the whole thing read to you, you actually can just press on there, and that's just things that we have to kind of train them on to do. And there's a student resource page that we give to teachers that has explore the tools, and it shows all the different tools that they can use, because it even has the little line reader that helps the kids who like with tracking issues can use that as well. So there's lots of little tools that we train them on how to use as well, which also mirrors on the IXL, similar tools, which is kind of nice. When we send scores, anytime for schools or professionals, for request scores, because a lot of when you're transitioning, they'll probably ask for standardized testing scores. We do send the MAP score. We also send the sheet so that any schools or professionals would know what's happening, which means if they kind of only we put these things in place so everyone knows what the environment was for that particular child for testing. So this will be with scores as well. You will also get a copy of this as well. So how do we use the test scores here? So like I said, in individual growth, we are looking at growth for risk scores. That's something we kind of are tracking and progressing. We also working on their test taking skills and their ability to independently use their strategy finder. That's something we're kind of watching and seeing if they can actually do that in real time in a standardized method. It gives them experience with standardized testing, because like I said, no matter where they go, it's going to happen, and we wouldn't be doing them justice if we didn't teach them how to take a standardized test. And also, like I said, identifying accommodations they may need for future testing, getting that good list for that, so when you go and you have to do a 504, you've got data that be like, my child needs this, here's the data that backs it up. Because we are a private school, so we're not mandated to do STAR testing. However, if your child has to go STAR testing, it is very helpful to start that process and have data that be like, this is what my child needs.
One of the ways our scores are not used in like deciding whether they go forward in a level or other places. We're never going to look at their MAP test and be like, oh no, their MAP test. I know in public schools and some other schools, you have to get certain scores on tests to be able to go to the next grade level. It is not used as any sort of like withholding of your student. We use more at their everyday functional, how they're doing in class and what they benefit within our programming. So it's not used in that way. Sometimes standardized tests feel really pressurized because you're like, oh, there's so much writing on their future. For us, that's not what we're using it for.
Do y'all use the scores to level set the work that they're doing in the class?
We could, like, we look at it and we're seeing, like, if the test says they're working on third grade level stuff and they did it pretty accurately, we would definitely take that into consideration. We would also look at informative assessment the teacher has also compiled and looked at that as a whole. So it's a kind of a piece of the puzzle when we're placing and putting kids in the right academic.
But if your child, in our eyes, we see them successfully working on like 4th grade math, and on the test it says that they're working on 3rd grade math, we can go back and double check to make sure they've mastered those concepts, but we're not going to pull them back and be like, whoa, MAP says you need to go back to 3rd grade. Like, whoop, back to 3rd grade math you go. Because like we said, there are so many other factors that could have gone into them working on that level math that we don't want to use it like punitively. Mm-hmm. But we do want to make sure that they are understanding those concepts, and if our data shows in the classroom that they're understanding those concepts, then we're like, okay, something else was going on, let's keep going with this.
It would just, like I said, it's just one piece that we put into consideration. We look at that, we look at the class data and the progress reports and what we have, and kind of look based on that information.
And we do encourage the teachers to look at the class scores holistically, like if on a section of grounding, all of the kids do terribly on that section, then that will help them guide the class in instruction. Like, okay, we need to know that. Foundational skills. As far as guided instruction, we kind of look at that in that realm for teachers, guidance for classroom.
Something I used in the classroom when I would see like a certain question and I kind of saw that the strategy that we had in place didn't necessarily work for the child, that kind of told me, it's like, we need a strategy that has simpler steps or something for the students. So that sometimes would help guide what sort of strategies needed to be edited or modified in their strategy binder, because it's like, that one had too many steps because I had one child who like did the strategy so beautifully, but like somehow he'd written the right answer on his board, but somehow the right answer did not get picked on the iPad. So it's like, clearly there's something we need to work here, because like he did the work but couldn't get it on the test. So that kind of told me, it's like, we need to kind of work on our steps here, because like he had the right idea, he knew what to do. There's a breakdown somewhere in the executive functioning. So that would kind of guide my instruction. Because I've literally had a kid write the right answer and pick the wrong one, and I'm like, no.
And the self-monitoring that goes into that, oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's like, you did all the work.
And we can't go and fix it for that.
No, it broke my heart. All right, now I'm going to leave it off to Steph.
Oh, there was one more thing that before we jump into speech
Yes.
that I was thinking about. We have talked about how we did it by age. And so your child might have started off getting, if they are older than what their age would, if they were like 8 and they would have been taking what, like the 3rd grade? Second or third, but they're in like a primary or lower, like they're working on 1st grade stuff. Because it is adaptive, it gets them to their grade level. So hopefully the grade level they're working on, so it won't be giving them all the level of questions that are in what their expected grade level would be on their age. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the great things about adaptive tests, is that you're not sitting down and getting all material based on your age and the grade level. You would be in another setting and having to answer those questions. And now to switch our brains totally, because speech language standardized assessments are a whole different thing. So every year built into your tuition, your child will receive some sort of speech and language assessment. Every year it might not be a fully standardized speech language assessment, but they will be getting some sort of assessment that helps us, once again, also monitor progress and develop goals. And ours is not at a standard time, because that would slam all. Because for many of you, you have one speech pathologist for 3 classrooms, so that's one person trying to do 30 assessments, and they take like 2 hours in one small amount of time. Not as easy as giving everyone an iPad and having them do all at once. So, speech language assessments are evaluation tools that have been developed using research that have standardization. Ours, every child gets these same questions. The test is the same questions every single time. Every time. It is not adaptive. The standardized scores have been kind of forced into a beautiful little bell curve. So the standardization and the ranges aren't different per age group, and we have to give it in a consistent and standardized measure each time. So kind of similar with the MAP testing, we really, although technically for these, they weren't standardized with any sort of accommodations. So oftentimes the test will say in big bubble, like really bold, like you cannot repeat a question, in which case we cannot repeat a question, or else the actual standardized scores are like gone. It's no longer standardized. So sometimes students are needing the accommodation of having a test question repeated again and again for, say, processing or understanding the concept. We cannot repeat the question. They can't hit a little button and have it said over and over again. So test scores look a little different here. So oftentimes when we're interpreting speech and language tests, we have to decide, like, is it truly, do they not understand this language concept? Or is there a processing thing there that maybe if we would have given the question in a slightly different way, or even just repeated it, they could have been able to give the answer. But we can't do that. Some tests are comprehensive, meaning they look at multiple aspects of language, receptive, expressive, pragmatics, morphology, vocabulary, like everything that's kind of under the language umbrella. And other standardized tests just hone in on something very specific, whether it be vocabulary or written expression, or just your oral language, narrative abilities, or your grammar and syntax. So depending on the test, you could be getting a broad test or something that's kind of honing in, which is nice because some students, especially when we're first getting to know them, a broad language test will give us an overall idea. Some of the children that have been here at Parrish for a long time, or we know that their areas of weakness is more in this area than that, we can use the tests that are a little more focused to kind of really hone in on their areas of progress and the areas that we still need to kind of work on and address and beef up. So, understanding their scores. These scores, unlike the RIT scores, are designed to rank them and compare them to their peers. We do use them to compare growth amongst themselves, and there are ways to look at it that way, but it really is set up to say, hey, we gave 100 kids, usually way more than 100, but 100 kids this test, and your child compares here compared to these 100. So if they have a score of like 50, 50 kids scored higher, 50 kids scored lower. They get a score in that range of 75, same thing, 25 were above, 75 were lower. So it really ranks them. There is, however, a large range of average. Most standardized scores have a range of average when you get your standard score of between 85 and 115. So they kind of force it into that. And I will show you, we have a pretty bell curve right there.
Are they being ranked against Parrish school kiddos or neurotypical?
Everyone. And that is a great question because some standardized tests will be standardized with children with language disorders in the population, and some standardized tests specifically leave out children with language disorders in their population. If you want to get really geeky about statistics, we can have a whole conversation about this. Some people in the field feel that it's beneficial to be standardized on a range of everyone in the population, so you can get a range, and other people are like, well, if we know you're disordered, we want to only test and get an idea of where averages of people who don't have a specific language disorder. There are positives and negatives, but yes, it depends on the test. I would say the majority of the tests have standardization on an entire population, and it's more it's less frequent to have a test that excluded certain populations.
Okay. But they would have language in that report saying who
yes.
they were being, okay.
Yeah, and it's a great question that you can ask the SLP too.
Okay.
Like, what population was this test standardized on?
And this is, again, age?
Yep, this is all based off of age. And you will get your scores based just off of age.
And the SLP assessment, it's not something created here at Parrish? It's
Nope.
a national?
It is, it's a national, it's a everyone who speaks English. They might get the same assessment in Australia. Maybe a little different in England because some of their vocab's a little different than ours, but it is all English, everyone nationally. In Canada, they use the same test.
Does it have a name?
They have a bunch of different names. I can give you a list as tall as I am.
And have y'all just picked one?
We typically, yes, so we typically look at your child and say, what did they get before, previously? If they haven't gotten anything previously, then what areas of language do we want to look at? Do we want to give them a whole big comprehensive test? And then we can pull from a range of like 10 different comprehensive language tests. Do we want to really hone on their pragmatic skills because their language skills within the classroom are looking strong? Then we'll give them a pragmatics language test. If we're looking at them and we're like, wow, we noticed that they're really doing well and they've had a lot of tests that are looking at their global language, but we want to see something that's a little more functional, let's give them a narrative assessment because narratives often give more information on what they're functionally using than just like pointing to a picture and being like, find the big black and white spotted dog. Given that one a lot. Or like, which one is the longest? You know, what is this boy doing? But if they have to develop, use a narrative and like come up with a story and answer comprehension questions, then a lot of times that's more functional and showing what they're able to do when you pull back some of the supports of like visuals and, you know, closed-ended choices. But there is a time and a place for having the very structured visual closed-ended courses. So that is a conversation that your SLP can have with you and that we look through and think of very thoughtfully. We try and make sure that we're giving an assessment that's going to give us the best information to learn more about your child.
So in choosing the test,
Mhm.
or choosing a test geared towards what you perceive to be their weakness?
Typically, we will look to see what we want more information on. And yes, sometimes that is their weakness, because that will tell us where our goals to drive therapy are, which is often hard as a parent then to be like, these are the areas, but hopefully they can explain it to you being like, they are doing such a great job in these areas that we are not concerned about these areas of their language, and we want to continue to use those areas to build their strengths, and let's beef up these areas too.
So in reporting to us, just for completeness, do we get an idea and a sense of where the mastery is, and therefore the weaknesses that are going to be focused on?
Yeah, hopefully in the report, yes. But we like to have, we like to put in there the areas of their strengths in the reports and in their therapy care plan, which is totally separate that they're getting. We have specifically structured them so that we are also highlighting their areas of strengths, because all of our kids here have beautiful strengths. And we should be using those strengths to help beef up the other areas.
I ask that because I'm sure all of us at home we know the strengths.
Yes.
It's easy to see the struggles, but naturally we worry about everything.
Oh yeah.
And so
you're speaking my language, yes.
Maybe it's a sense of relief to see what they are, but it's also it's a sense of relief, but it's also a way of not having a constant worry about all of the struggles, and I hate to use the word failures, but in some ways the things that they're not fully succeeding at.
No, I agree. As a parent, you don't want to just be bombarded with things that your child is struggling with and not doing well at. We want to highlight all areas.
We're obviously here for speech.
Yeah.
SLP kind of challenges.
And that's one of the things that I often say, when we're giving speech and language reports, it's like before I hand it, I'm like, we know this is an area of struggle for them, so the scores may be a little low, but we know that that's why they're here, and so we can use this to help. And it's not so much as we want to show you all of the ways that your child isn't doing well, but of like, your child is amazing, and here are the ways where we can continue to work on to get their growth going and reaching their full potential.
And I know this is my child in particular, there's certain areas that I just totally don't understand. I can see it exists, but I don't know that I can put a finger on it, right? And that's, and again, maybe that's the whole, maybe that is the concern and how to.
And sometimes that is what drives picking which test to use, is that sometimes we pick it and we're like, okay, we're looking at this child and we see, but we can't put our finger right on it. So let's see if maybe this assessment will help kind of shed some light, and then we can be like, that's where we can support them. So a lot of times I know when I'm looking at assessment that's where I go from it. I'm like, okay, what do I think will bring out that area, so I can kind of like peel back the layers and be like, this is the lagging skill. If we can really hone in on this, it'll help bring everything else up. That's the hope. But you're right, every time you receive scores and they're lower, and even though you know that they're going to be low because that's your child's area of weakness, it's a kick in the gut. Yeah. You're like, well, that didn't feel good, but.
I did a general speech testing, like the one that they give you, just walk into like a therapy place and they, be evaluated. Yeah. And then they took that and she went even further into like pinpointing exactly where his struggles were. So I couldn't get it out either, and I didn't really know how to explain it. But whatever the test she did is like spot on. I think this is my son's exactly.
Because I think the clinic stuff.
Yeah, it's like. Yeah.
We're hoping to make these as useful, useful as we can to drive therapy and to help them be as successful as they can, because all of our kids here have amazing potential. And if we can kind of get to that area of where the lagging skill is, then we can use that to drive and support their amazing potential while still using all of their other great strengths to help pull those things up. Yeah. So how our scores are used here, since they do just give us one snapshot of their abilities, like I said, sometimes we can't even repeat a question, so that might be something that throws the scores off. We just use them, like I said, to try and drive where our therapy should go next and to help us get a complete picture of the child, their areas of strength and weakness, how we can use their strengths, how we can beef up their areas of weakness. You can use these to take to a public school. Even if your child is in a private school, legally they are still able to access public school supports. So you could take our test and present it in an IEP meeting. We've had parents do that as well, that were like, hey, your testing showed this, but this testing showed this, so let's reconvene. And they legally have to look at it. They do not have to accept it, but they have to at least look at it. And we track long-term progress. That's just what we want to see. And of course, these tests, unlike the MAP test, are shoving them into a standardization. And so they are comparing them with the other kids. We don't want to compare them with the other kids. It'll give us those scores. But what we're looking at is for the underlying progress of themselves to themselves. That is much harder to track on these standardized tests than it is with MAP testing, which is one of the reasons I do like the MAP testing, of it tracking your child against your child. But we do look for the long-term progress, even if it's just, hey, last time we looked at their, understanding of spoken paragraphs, and that was an area of struggle, but hey, they've moved up and now they're understanding them more, especially because as they age, the questions in the paragraphs are going to get longer and longer. But you're like, hey, they're making some progress with that, that's how we use it. It's not used, once again, especially with our younger levels, or even here, the language testing isn't used as the one piece of the puzzle that might determine which level they go to, or anything here within placement. We use the whole picture of the child for all of that. Other pieces of the puzzle, other than just the standardized assessments, there are criterion referenced assessments, which just go through and are more like a checklist based off of just whole childhood development. We like to use a lot of language samples. So once again, those aren't standardized because every child says something different in their language sample, but there are standardized ways to assess language samples. But we like to use their language samples to see more like functionally, how are they doing in a conversation? Narratives, them being able to tell stories. You can learn a lot from observations. Teacher and parent report. The parents, you see your kids in such a different way in different settings, that getting your information and input is always helpful. Student work samples. And we can look at things like the MAP testing more from me as the executive functioning. And also, are they understanding the language used within these tests? Are they understanding all of the different words that mean subtract? Are they understanding all of the different words that mean add? I'm telling you, some of these tests and questions, and even just on my own daughter's homework, are straight up tricky. And they throw in all of this extra information about apples, and then they're asking you about cookies, and you're like, what? Yes, and I'm just like, what are they even asking? So some of it, they will purposely give extra information, and your child has to know what's the important information and what's not. And if our children are having trouble with picking out the clues and deciding what is important information and what is not, and that's a language goal, that has nothing to do with their math. They probably can add and subtract. So to me, that's okay, now we need to work on this as a language aspect. We need to help them be able to go through and use strategies or work on inferencing skills to figure out what they are asking and what they're not asking. And we can tackle those things as a language side of it instead of it being just their math skill, which is one of the negatives about the math test, is they were trying to trick your kid and it worked. And it has nothing to do with their understanding of division. I don't know why they do it, but they do it. So we use the MAP assessments in that way, more to help your child show all of the knowledge that they do have. Do you guys have any questions? We did pull the MAP norms from the actual map testing website. Any other
So
questions?
last year's results, we should be able to find on the portal.
Yes.
Looking at the portal, and then in your October conferences, their map scores will have your bar graph will have last year's October and last year's April.
Let me see if we can go.
But it should